Bienvenue, mesdames, messieurs. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps I should be speaking both French and English. If I may, I just want to introduce myself. My name is James Brown. I'm the director of the Paris campus of Schiller International University. I just want to say very briefly how honored I am to help organize this series of events and the exhibition of the works of Oliver Bevan. I would like to just introduce as well Professor Becquet, who I'll also pass the baton to her. She'll give a brief introduction about Oliver. Et donc, pour répéter en français, je suis très honoré d'être ici avec vous, de vous inviter à cette conférence sur les œuvres de Oliver Bevan. Demain soir, également, vernissage sur le campus de Schiller Paris. Et donc, je présente aussi le professeur Becquet, qui est notre professeur de l'histoire de l'art, qui va présenter un peu plus amplement, brièvement aussi, Oliver Bevan. Merci, merci d'être ici.
Good evening, everybody. We at Schiller are delighted to host Oliver Bevan, whose work spans the great movements of the second half of the 20th century and informs those the opening decades of the 21st, impressively encompassing modernism and postmodernism. His first exhibits, starting in the mid-60s, are set firmly in the alt art movement and a playful exploration of the possibilities of experimental perspectives in the plural and their effect on the viewer. Further exhibits invited the spectator to actively engage with these potentialities, incorporating movement into his creations, even to the point of sorts of kinetic magic lanterns. A radical change comes about in the latter 70s when he leaves his urban London home for the wide-open provinces of Canada, where the cutting-edge intellectualism of op art morphs into what might seem to be its opposite, the age-old pursuit of the landscape. In other works, one senses also, even in its abstractifying subjects, an embrace of organic forms at first glance pulls apart from the geometrical tendencies of his beginnings. Returning to London, he ends his Canadian period with cityscapes in several mediums, among them photography, of which he says, to paraphrase, it had everything: light, reflection, the city. In painting during the 80s, whether it be pastel or his first love, oil, these cityscapes, at first tending to a kind of neo-cubism, become, in spite of himself, more figurative, more realistic. And this closes his modern period and moves him definitively toward the postmodern. Ironically, this passage again towards what is cutting edge harks back to the Impressionist celebration of the city and the common subjects to be celebrated on canvas, the same way of old history and mythology were glorified. If I may, Oliver Bevan becomes, for me at least, a postmodern flaneur, that this is not only in London but in Venice, Paris, and Barcelona. Of these figures that begin to appear in his cityscapes, we see in the 90s most notably children in all their perpetual movement and spontaneity, recalling the playfulness and interactivity of some of his early exhibitions, as well as his explorations of kinetics. The turn of the millennium sees him change residence to Uzès in the south of France. This, along with his teaching residencies in Tuscany, are a revelation of intense sun, and the setting encourages him to leave, at least for a time, his urban landscapes for more small-town settings. His present fascination with all forms of water in their movement, flow, and reflection surface are familiar themes that must now be understood as concomitant with the heat and strong daylight of his new home. Without further ado, I leave the artist himself to speak of his modernist crises better than I possibly can.
Thank you, Vicki. Before starting, I would like to express my deep thanks to Dr. James Brown for organizing these events at the exhibition and this conference. And also my partner, Annie Lemay, without whom my career would certainly not be at the level it is. She's been amazing. Now, my beginnings. I was born during the Second World War, in the middle of the Second World War, 1941, when Britain stood alone against Germany. I don't quite know what my parents were doing, having a baby at that point, but I never asked them whether perhaps I was an accident. I don't know. But anyway, I grew up without parents, but in with my grandparents in a village next to a provincial town in eastern England. At the time, the kind of people that I was born into didn't bother to bring up their own children. They hired nannies, governesses, all sorts of hired help. A strange affair, I think, really, and I took this as completely normal. They sent me to a primary school at the age of 6, I suppose, which I really liked and enjoyed the company of other children. But 2 years later, I was pulled out of the primary school to study at home with the woman who had taught my mother, who was a dragon, and I didn't like. And at that point, I had rather lost confidence with my own age group, and was then sent away to boarding schools from the age of 9 onwards, an experience which I could have done without, frankly. I did not like being away from home, even though home was not like other people's. But my second boarding school was a very eminent institution called Eton College. And there was a long tradition of individuality and rebellion. And my form of rebellion took to going to the art department at all available moments and painting. I discovered, in fact, thanks to a friend who became a rather eminent writer, he's called Heathcote Williams, an even more rebellious person than me, much more. But he went down, he said, oh, you really must come down and paint. So I went with him and painted. He did the most atrocious things I've ever seen, and I suppose I did probably fairly atrocious things as well. But the experience of oil paint was so sensual and so strong that I felt immediately at home with it. And by the age of 17, I thought I would become a painter. I will now, wait, don't change anything. We'll open that up. This is a painting that I did. I didn't know anything about Nicolas de Staël at the time. People told me afterwards that there was a painter called Nicolas de Staël who had used a palette knife in much the same sort of way. For me, I did a long series of paintings rather like this, from the age of sort of 17 to 18. And by the time I was 18, I was headhunted by someone from the Royal College of Art, who later became president of the Royal Academy, for an experimental course at the Royal College. Royal College is normally postgraduate, and was at that time, and the students arrived and did 3 years, having already done at least 4 years in art schools. And they thought, in their wisdom, that this was too long to spend in an institution. So what if we take a few likely young people, and we give them an intensive course over a year, and we throw them in with the postgraduates, which is what they did to us. But their idea of an intensive course was about 6 weeks, after which, once a month, a tutorial. So we sunk or we swam. And I guess I swam, more or less. I tried everything. These sort of early abstract pieces really kind of petered out because I needed a more solid basis, especially in drawing. Next picture, please. I've got books and books, notebooks like this, of drawings done live from the person. And I tried a form of expressionism. I tried all sorts of things. Next picture. No. Don't know what's happened there. That's the last one. No, that's the one. This was a view from my window where I lived near Kew Gardens in outer London. And it's probably the only good painting I did all my time at the Royal College. When I left, I burnt all the others. I thought they just were not up to it. But about a year after painting this, I went to a lecture on Vasarely, who was a painter not really known at all in England at that point. And the lecturer, a man called Peter de Francio, was a good painter. He presented the some installation works by Vezzarelli, which absolutely inspired me. I thought, this is what we need to be doing. And the following day, I started working on geometric drawings. As I thought, now I found my way. It was like a real conversion, dramatic conversion. So that was my first modernist crisis. To move from basically a painting that could have been done in 1890, or even earlier, to a painting could only have been done in 1964. So off we went. Can we do the next slide? I realised as I left the Royal College that I really didn't know quite what I was doing. I was thrashing around with geometric forms and optical effects. So I gave myself a crash course in monochrome works, geometric monochrome works, which rather resembled architectural facades. I worked solidly away at these. We can take the next one. Yeah, they first of all were all up and vertical, horizontal, then I added diagonals, and then the next one, added colour, and at this point I managed to get my first London exhibition in a rather unusual gallery called Grabowski. And Mr. Grabowski, he had a gallery which supported new artists, but he also had a business selling pharmaceuticals and exporting them to Poland, because he was Polish. And at the end of his life, he bequeathed his collection to a museum in Poland, which is why I'm in a museum in Lodz in Poland. I showed 3 times with him in solo format. This painting unfortunately never survived, but another one the same size. It was big, it was about 2.5 meters long. But the other one did survive and was bought by, I'm not sure who, but it's somewhere in the world. On, next one. I rapidly became interested in other kinds of illusions and used the use of isometric perspective. We'll go on again. Yes, these are a series of paintings on plywood, which were cut out, contreplaqué, cut out into shapes, of which I sold quite a lot of them. The ones that were not sold have unfortunately not survived being moved many different places because they've got sharp points which have got damaged. So I had to dump a lot of those, I'm sad to say. On again. This is in fact a screen print which I printed in my own studio on very beautiful paper. Just to show that my ideas kept on evolving. This is based on a number series. On again. At about this time, I got a commission, a rather wonderful commission, to do a series of book jackets for a publishing house called William Collins. They had a series called Fontana Modern Masters, which were important thinkers who changed the course of people's ideas in the 20th century.